The morning sun filtered through the windows of Manny Pacquiao's training facility in General Santos City, casting long shadows across the empty boxing ring where he had spent countless hours perfecting his craft. The champion sat quietly in his office, surrounded by the familiar scent of leather gloves and the echoes of years spent chasing greatness. His hands moved methodically through a stack of fan mail, each letter a reminder of the lives his journey had touched across the Philippines and beyond. The routine had become sacred to him, a moment of connection with the people who had supported him through every triumph and setback. Today, however, one envelope would stand apart from all the others, carrying within it a story that would move the heart of even the strongest fighter. The letter bore the careful handwriting of someone young, each word crafted with the precision of hope, mixed with desperation. Manny's eyes traced the opening lines, as 15-year-old Maria Esperanza introduced herself from a small barangay in Mindanao, her words immediately revealing a spirit that refused to be broken, despite circumstances that would challenge the strongest souls. She wrote about her love for boxing, how watching his fights had given her strength during the darkest moments of her battle with leukemia. The pages trembled slightly in his weathered hands as he read her description of sitting with her grandmother, watching his matches on their old television set, dreaming of meeting the man who had shown the world that greatness could emerge from the humblest beginnings. Her words painted a picture of a young girl who found courage in his victories, who saw in his success a reflection of what the Filipino spirit could achieve. The medical details were sparse but devastating, woven between expressions of admiration and gratitude that made Manny's chest tighten with emotion. Maria explained how the doctors had given her family the timeline that no parent should ever hear, how the treatments had become more about comfort than cure. Yet through every line, her personality shone brightly, filled with the same fighting spirit that had driven him from the streets of Kibawe to the championship rings of Las Vegas. She wrote about her dream of becoming a boxer herself, how she had practiced throwing punches in her hospital room when the nurses weren't watching. The innocence and determination in her words reminded him of his own childhood dreams, when poverty and hardship seemed like opponents that could be defeated with enough heart and persistence. What struck him most profoundly was not her request to meet him, but rather her gratitude for what he had already given her without knowing it. Maria described how his story had taught her that being born into struggle didn't define the limits of what someone could achieve, that every fight in the ring was really a fight for everyone who had ever felt overlooked or forgotten. She thanked him for showing her that champions weren't just made in gymnasiums, but in the quiet moments when someone chooses to keep fighting despite overwhelming odds. Her letter contained no complaints about her condition, no bitterness about the unfairness of life, only appreciation for the hope and inspiration he had unknowingly provided during her darkest hours. The purity of her perspective cut through his heart like a perfectly thrown combination, leaving him momentarily breathless in the silence of his office. The final paragraphs revealed the true purpose of her letter, not as a plea for attention, but as a gift she wanted to give back to him. Maria wrote about her plans to attend the local boxing academy once her treatment was complete, how she wanted to teach other children that fighting was about more than throwing punches. It was about finding strength when everything seems impossible. She described her vision of opening a small gym in her barangay, where kids like herself could learn that their circumstances didn't have to determine their destiny. The letter concluded with a simple statement that would haunt Manny for the rest of the day. She didn't need to meet him to know that heroes were real, because he had already changed her life simply by refusing to give up on his own dreams. As he carefully folded the letter and placed it in his desk drawer, Manny Pacquiao knew that his next fight would not take place in any arena, but in the heart of a young girl who had already shown more courage than most champions ever would. The afternoon training session felt different, as thoughts of Maria occupied every corner of his mind, her words echoing between the rhythm of his footwork and the sharp crack of leather against heavy bags. His sparring partners noticed the unusual intensity in his movements, the way his punches seemed to carry an extra weight of purpose that hadn't been there in the morning. The coaches exchanged knowing glances, recognizing the signs of their champion processing something significant, the way he had always channeled emotion into action throughout his legendary career. Between rounds, Manny found himself staring at the framed photographs of his family that lined the gym walls, thinking about the blessing of health, the gift of time, and the responsibility that came with the platform God had given him. As the sun set over General Santos City, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, The 8-division world champion made a decision that would prove that the greatest victories often happen far from any spotlight or cheering crowd. That evening, Manny sat in the quiet sanctuary of his home, surrounded by the gentle sounds of his family going about their evening routines. Jinky moved gracefully through the kitchen, preparing dinner while humming softly to herself, her presence a calming force that had anchored him through every storm of his career. The laughter of his children drifted from the living room where Jimuel was helping Princess with her homework, their voices a reminder of the simple joys that made all his sacrifices worthwhile. In this moment of domestic tranquility, Maria's letter felt like a calling that transcended the boundaries of fame and responsibility, speaking to something deeper in his soul that had always driven him to fight for more than just personal glory. The weight of her words pressed against his consciousness, transforming what could have been just another fan letter into a mission that demanded immediate action. He pulled out his phone and began making calls, starting with his longtime friend and manager, who had helped coordinate countless charitable visits over the years. The conversation revealed the complexity of arranging such a visit, from security considerations to media protocols, but Manny's voice carried an urgency that made it clear this was not a request, but a necessity. His team had seen him dedicate himself to causes before, but something in his tone suggested this visit held a significance that went beyond typical charitable appearances. They began working through the logistics, while Manny simultaneously reached out to medical contacts, seeking advice on how to approach a situation that required sensitivity, timing, and the kind of genuine human connection that no amount of preparation could fully script. The wheels of compassion began turning with the efficiency of a championship training camp, but driven by the pure motivation of one heart reaching out to another. The research phase began immediately, as Manny's team worked to learn more about Maria's condition and circumstances without compromising her family's privacy. They discovered that she lived with her grandmother, Dolores, in a modest house near Davao City, that her parents had died in a motorcycle accident 3 years earlier, and that her medical care was being provided through a combination of government assistance and community fundraising efforts. The financial struggles were significant, but secondary to the emotional challenges of a teenager facing mortality while carrying the additional burden of being essentially orphaned before her illness began. Manny learned that Maria had been documenting her journey through social media posts that displayed remarkable maturity and positivity, sharing encouraging messages with other young cancer patients while never complaining about her own circumstances. Her online presence revealed a young woman who had become an informal counselor to other families dealing with similar challenges, proof that her fighting spirit extended far beyond her own battle. The medical consultation painted a picture that demanded urgency, as doctors explained that Maria's condition had progressed to a stage where time was measured in weeks rather than months. The oncologist spoke carefully about the balance between maintaining hope and acknowledging reality, explaining that Maria's awareness of her prognosis was complete but had not diminished her determination to make her remaining time meaningful. Manny listened to the medical details with the same focus he brought to studying fight footage, understanding that this mission required the same level of preparation and commitment as any championship bout. The doctor mentioned that Maria's spirits had remained remarkably high throughout her treatment, that she often encouraged other patients, and had specifically mentioned how watching boxing matches gave her strength during chemotherapy sessions. This revelation deepened Manny's sense of connection to her struggle, recognizing in her approach to fighting cancer the same mentality that had carried him through the most difficult moments of his own career. The planning session that night involved Manny's closest advisors, including his longtime trainer Freddie Roach, who had flown in from the United States and understood better than anyone the champion's need to balance public responsibilities with personal convictions. They discussed the importance of making this visit completely private, free from media coverage or publicity that might compromise the authenticity of the moment or place additional pressure on Maria's family. Manny was adamant that this should not become a public relations opportunity, but rather a genuine expression of gratitude towards someone who had found inspiration in his journey. The team developed a plan that would allow for maximum flexibility, understanding that the emotional dynamics of such a visit could not be scripted or controlled. They arranged for backup plans, alternative transportation, and contingencies that would ensure nothing interfered with what Manny saw as one of the most important fights of his life. The night before his departure, Manny spent time in prayer and reflection, sitting in his home chapel where he had found peace before every major fight of his career. The familiar rituals of meditation and spiritual preparation took on new meaning as he contemplated the responsibility of bringing comfort to someone facing the ultimate challenge. He thought about his own children, imagining how he would want someone to respond if one of them were in Maria's situation, and felt the weight of representing not just himself, but all the hopes and dreams that people had projected onto his success. The letter sat open beside him, each word now memorized but still capable of stirring emotions that reminded him why he had chosen to dedicate his life to something larger than personal achievement. As he prepared for sleep, Manny Pacquiao carried the certainty that tomorrow would bring one of the most meaningful moments of his life, a chance to give back to someone who had already given him the gift of perspective and renewed purpose. The pre-dawn darkness of General Santos City provided the perfect cover for Manny's departure, as his small convoy moved quietly through empty streets toward the airport, where a chartered plane waited to carry him on this mission of compassion. His security team had worked throughout the night to ensure complete privacy, understanding that any media attention could transform this personal pilgrimage into a spectacle that would diminish its meaning for everyone involved. Manny sat in the back seat of the SUV, wearing simple civilian clothes instead of his usual designer attire, carrying only a small bag containing a few meaningful gifts he had carefully selected for Maria. The weight of anticipation settled over him, like the familiar tension before a championship fight. But this nervous energy was different, born not from concern about performance, but from the desire to bring genuine comfort to someone who had already endured more than most people face in a lifetime. The flight to Davao City passed in contemplative silence, as Manny gazed down at the Philippine archipelago spread beneath the morning clouds, each island a reminder of the millions of people who had supported his career and found meaning in his success. His assistant provided updates on the coordination with Maria's family, confirming that the visit remained a secret shared only by her grandmother Dolores and the medical team who had facilitated the arrangement. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Manny would arrive at the small medical facility where Maria was receiving palliative care, spend whatever time felt appropriate, and leave without fanfare or documentation. No photographers, no interviews, no social media posts that might exploit a moment that belonged entirely to a brave young woman and her fight against impossible odds. The purity of this approach felt right to Manny, who had learned that the most meaningful moments of his life had always happened away from cameras and crowds. The drive from the airport to the medical facility took them through neighborhoods that reminded Manny of his own childhood, where families lived in modest homes but maintained gardens that bloomed with tropical flowers despite economic hardships. Children played in the streets, their laughter echoing through open windows where mothers prepared meals, and fathers returned from day labor jobs that barely covered basic necessities. This landscape of resilient poverty was familiar territory for the champion, who had never forgotten that his success was built on the foundation of a community that refused to let circumstances define their possibilities. The sight of a small boxing gym tucked between a convenience store and a repair shop made him smile, remembering his own early training in similar facilities where dreams were forged in sweat and determination rather than expensive equipment and professional coaching. As they approached the medical facility, Manny felt his heartbeat increase in a way that reminded him of walking toward the ring in Las Vegas, that mixture of excitement and responsibility that came with knowing that the next few hours could change everything for everyone involved. The building was modest but well-maintained, its walls painted in cheerful colors that spoke to the staff's commitment to maintaining hope even in circumstances that often challenged the deepest faith. Nurses moved efficiently through hallways lined with artwork created by patients, their quiet professionalism a testament to the kind of everyday heroism that rarely received recognition but formed the backbone of healing in communities throughout the Philippines. Dr. Remedios, the oncologist who had been caring for Maria, met them at a side entrance and briefed Manny on what to expect, explaining that Maria was having a good day, but that her energy levels fluctuated unpredictably as her body continued its brave but losing battle against the disease. The final moments before meeting Maria felt suspended in time as Manny stood outside her room, gathering the emotional strength needed to be fully present for someone who had already given him so much without knowing it. Through the partially open door, he could hear the soft murmur of conversation between Maria and her grandmother, their voices carrying the easy intimacy of two people who had learned to find joy in small moments despite overwhelming circumstances. The room smelled faintly of jasmine from flowers that loving visitors had brought, mixed with the clinical cleanliness that marked all medical facilities, but somehow felt less institutional here, where personal touches had been allowed to soften the harsh realities of serious illness. Manny took a deep breath, said a quick prayer for wisdom and strength, and stepped forward to meet the young woman whose courage had already taught him new lessons about what it meant to be a true champion in the battles that mattered most. The knock on the door was gentle but confident, carrying with it the weight of one fighter, preparing to meet another in an arena where victory was measured not in titles or prize money, but in moments of human connection that transcended the boundaries between celebrity and fanny, between the famous and the forgotten. Dr. Remedios entered first, her smile warm but professional, as she announced that Maria had a very special visitor who had traveled far to meet her. The anticipation in the room was palpable but peaceful, charged with the energy that comes when something long hoped for is about to become reality. Through the doorway stepped Manny Pacquiao, his presence immediately filling the small space with a combination of humility and strength that had made him beloved far beyond the world of boxing. The moment had arrived for two fighters to meet, each carrying their own form of courage, each ready to discover what could happen when genuine admiration met authentic compassion in a place where miracles were measured not in healing, but in the depth of human understanding and shared grace. The moment Maria's eyes met Manny's, time seemed to pause as recognition flooded her face with an expression of disbelief that quickly transformed into the purest joy he had ever witnessed. Her hands, weakened by months of treatment but still capable of conveying emotion, rose slowly to cover her mouth as tears began streaming down her cheeks in rivers of overwhelmed gratitude. Manny approached her bedside with the same careful respect he showed when entering a sacred space, his own eyes misting as he took in the sight of this remarkable young woman whose spirit had remained unbroken despite the visible toll her battle had taken on her physical form. The room seemed to shrink around them, creating an intimate bubble where the outside world disappeared and only two souls existed, connected by a bond that transcended the usual boundaries between strangers. Maria's grandmother, Dolores, stood quietly in the corner, her weathered hands clasped in prayer as she witnessed the fulfillment of her granddaughter's most cherished wish. Manny settled into the chair beside Maria's bed, his movements gentle and unhurried, as he reached out to take her hand in both of his, the calloused palms of a champion cradling the delicate fingers of a girl who had fought battles no teenager should ever face. The physical contact seemed to anchor them both to the reality of this miraculous moment, proving that sometimes dreams do materialize in ways that exceed even the most hopeful imagination. Maria's voice was barely above a whisper, as she struggled to find words adequate to express what his presence meant to her, but Manny understood that no words were necessary in a moment that spoke directly from heart to heart. He told her softly that he had come because her letter had reminded him of why he fought, that her courage had inspired him more than any championship belt ever could. The simplicity of their exchange belied the profound depth of connection forming between them, two fighters recognizing in each other the qualities that define true champions. The conversation that followed flowed with surprising ease as Maria's initial shock gave way to the comfortable familiarity she had always felt with the man whose career she had followed so devotedly. She shared stories of watching his fights with her grandmother, describing how they would gather their neighbors to crowd around their small television whenever he competed, turning their humble living room into a celebration of Filipino pride and determination. Manny listened with genuine fascination as she recounted specific moments from fights he had almost forgotten, her detailed memory proving that she had absorbed not just the outcomes but the emotional journey of each battle. Her analysis of his fighting style showed a sophisticated understanding of boxing that impressed him, revealing that her love for the sport went far beyond casual fandom into the realm of true student of the art. The respect in her voice when she spoke about his career was matched by the admiration in his expression as he recognized the depth of her knowledge and passion. The gift exchange began when Manny presented Maria with a pair of boxing gloves he had worn during training, personally signed with a message that would remain private between them, but carried all the encouragement and recognition one fighter could offer another. Her reaction was immediate and overwhelming as she hugged the gloves to her chest like precious treasures, while tears of gratitude renewed their journey down her face. In return, She insisted on giving him something she had been working on during her hospital stays, a handwritten notebook filled with inspirational quotes, personal reflections, and her own philosophy about finding strength in the midst of struggle. The pages revealed a maturity and wisdom that far exceeded her years, filled with insights about resilience, faith, and the importance of using personal battles to help others facing similar challenges. As Manny read through her words, he realized he was holding not just a gift but a masterpiece of courage that would influence his own perspective for years to come. The medical equipment in the room provided a constant reminder of the realities they were both choosing to transcend, but somehow its presence only made their connection more precious rather than more poignant. Maria spoke about her treatment with matter-of-fact acceptance that impressed Manny, describing her daily routine with the same strategic approach he might use to discuss training regimens. She explained how she had learned to find victory in small achievements, completing a round of chemotherapy, maintaining her appetite for one more day, or simply finding the energy to encourage another patient struggling with their own battle. Her definition of winning had been refined through necessity into something that had nothing to do with defeating an opponent and everything to do with maintaining dignity, hope, and compassion regardless of circumstances. The profound wisdom in her approach to fighting humbled Manny, who recognized that he was in the presence of someone who understood the true meaning of championship-level courage. As their time together deepened, both realized they were experiencing something that would remain forever sacred in their hearts, a meeting of minds and spirits that proved genuine heroism exists in forms that often go unrecognized by the world. The laughter that began to fill the room surprised everyone, including Maria and Manny themselves, as they discovered that even in the most serious circumstances, joy had a way of asserting itself when two people connected on the deepest level. Maria's sense of humor emerged as they talked, revealing a personality that had refused to be diminished by her circumstances, and Manny found himself relaxing in a way that reminded him of time spent with his own children. The ease of their interaction felt miraculous to everyone present, proof that sometimes the most meaningful relationships can form instantly when hearts recognize kindred spirits across any divide of age, experience, or circumstance. Their conversation ranged from boxing techniques to family stories, from favorite foods to dreams about the future, covering the full spectrum of human experience with the comfortable familiarity of old friends catching up after a long separation. The 2 hours they had planned to spend together stretched into 3, then 4, as neither wanted to break the spell of a connection that felt like the answer to prayers neither had known they were praying. The afternoon light streaming through the hospital window created a golden atmosphere around Maria and Manny as their conversation evolved into something that felt less like a celebrity visit and more like a gathering of family members sharing the most important moments of their lives. Maria's energy seemed to be sustained by pure joy as she described her dreams of the boxing academy she wanted to create, complete with detailed plans for how she would teach children that fighting was about building character rather than just throwing punches. Manny listened with the attention of someone receiving wisdom from a master teacher, occasionally offering suggestions, but mostly marveling at the sophistication of her vision for helping others find strength through sport. Her grandmother Dolores watched from her corner chair, witnessing a transformation in her granddaughter that seemed to turn back the clock to before illness had entered their lives, when Maria's eyes still sparkled with the unlimited possibilities that should define every teenager's worldview. The moment that would forever remain etched in Manny's memory came when Maria asked if he would be willing to teach her a few basic boxing combinations, explaining that she had always wondered what it felt like to throw punches with proper technique rather than the shadow boxing she had practiced alone in her room. Despite the IV line in her arm and the obvious fragility of her condition, her request carried the determination of someone who had never stopped believing in the power of dreams to transcend physical limitations. Manny's initial hesitation gave way to understanding as he recognized that this was not about physical exertion, but about the spiritual connection between teacher and student that had always been at the heart of his love for boxing. He stood carefully and demonstrated a simple 1-2 combination in slow motion, his movements graceful and controlled as he showed her the fundamental mechanics that had carried him to 8 world championships in different weight divisions. Maria's attempt to mirror his movements from her hospital bed created a scene that embodied everything beautiful about the human spirit's refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. Her punches were weak and unsteady, limited by the medical equipment and her compromised physical condition, but her form showed natural instinct, and her eyes blazed with the intensity of someone discovering a new dimension of personal power. Manny provided gentle corrections and encouragement, his coaching voice taking on the same patient tone he used with his own children when teaching them new skills. The technical instruction became secondary to the emotional experience of two fighters sharing the sacred ritual of passing knowledge from one generation to the next, creating a moment of pure connection that transcended the clinical setting and transformed the hospital room into a place where dreams could still flourish despite the harsh realities surrounding them. The storytelling session that followed revealed depths of Maria's character that continued to amaze everyone present as she shared experiences from her treatment that demonstrated wisdom far beyond her years and compassion that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker as her own situation became more challenging. She described befriending other young patients and becoming an informal counselor who helped newcomers adjust to the emotional challenges of serious illness, her natural empathy turning her personal struggle into a ministry of encouragement for others facing similar battles. Manny found himself taking mental notes as she explained her philosophy of finding purpose in pain, recognizing principles that applied not just to medical challenges, but to any situation where someone must choose between bitterness and grace. Her stories painted a picture of hospital hallways transformed into places of hope through her influence, where other patients had learned to see their treatments as training sessions in the art of resilience, rather than merely medical procedures to be endured. The music that began playing softly in the background came from Maria's phone, where she had created a playlist of songs that had sustained her through the most difficult moments of her treatment, including several that had been playing during Manny's most memorable fights. As the familiar sounds filled the room, both found themselves transported back to moments of triumph and struggle that had defined their respective journeys, creating a soundtrack for their meeting that seemed orchestrated by forces beyond their control. Maria began humming along to a song that had played during Manny's victory over Oscar de la Hoya, her voice still melodious despite the effects of her treatment, and soon Manny joined her in creating an impromptu concert that transformed the clinical atmosphere into something approaching celebration. The moment encapsulated everything magical about their connection, two people from vastly different circumstances finding common ground in shared memories, mutual respect, and the inexplicable joy that emerges when genuine hearts recognize each other across any divide. The photo session that concluded this magical afternoon was Maria's idea, as she wanted to document not just their meeting, but the feeling of hope and possibility that Manny's presence had rekindled in her spirit. Using her grandmother's simple camera, they captured images that would become treasured beyond any professional portraits either had ever posed for, their faces glowing with authentic happiness that couldn't be staged or manufactured. The pictures showed two champions at different stages of their respective fights, both bearing the marks of their battles, but neither allowing circumstances to diminish their capacity for joy and connection. Maria insisted that her favorite photo be one where they were both laughing at something funny Manny had said about his early training days, their heads thrown back in abandoned mirth that seemed to declare victory over every force that had tried to steal their ability to find humor and lightness, even in serious circumstances. As the afternoon wound toward its inevitable conclusion, neither wanted to acknowledge that this perfect interlude would soon become a cherished memory rather than a continuing reality, but both understood that some moments are so complete in themselves that they need no extension to achieve their purpose of transforming everyone they touch. Grandmother Dolores, who had remained a quiet but constant presence throughout the afternoon, finally stepped forward as the golden hour light began to fade, her weathered face bearing the accumulated wisdom of 7 decades spent navigating life's unpredictable currents with grace and determination. Her approach to Manny carried the dignity of someone who had raised a remarkable granddaughter, while managing her own grief over the loss of her daughter and son-in-law, transforming personal tragedy into a foundation of strength that had sustained Maria through her most challenging moments. The elderly woman's hands shook slightly as she reached for Manny's, not from nervousness, but from the overwhelming emotion of witnessing her granddaughter experience pure joy during what they both knew might be among her final weeks of life. Her eyes, still bright despite the tears that had flowed throughout the afternoon, reflected a gratitude that went far beyond words, encompassing appreciation not just for his visit, but for the example his life had provided Maria throughout her illness. The conversation between Dolores and Manny revealed the full scope of how his career had influenced their family's journey through crisis, as the grandmother shared stories about the countless evenings they had spent watching his fights together, using his victories as opportunities to discuss perseverance, faith, and the importance of never surrendering regardless of circumstances. She described how Maria had insisted on staying awake for fights broadcast in the middle of the night Philippine time, her determination to witness every moment of his competitions serving as training for her own battle against overwhelming odds. The elderly woman's voice carried both pride and sorrow as she explained how her granddaughter had used Manny's comeback victories as inspiration during the most discouraging phases of her treatment, finding parallels between his ability to overcome early round difficulties and her own need to persist through setbacks that would have devastated someone with less fighting spirit. The family history that Dolores shared painted a picture of resilience that had been passed down through generations, with Maria representing the latest in a line of strong women who had learned to find opportunity within adversity and purpose within pain. She spoke about her daughter, Maria's mother, who had worked multiple jobs to support her family's dreams while maintaining optimism that her sacrifices would create better opportunities for her children. The motorcycle accident that had claimed both parents 3 years earlier could have destroyed Maria's spirit, but instead had seemed to deepen her appreciation for life and strengthen her determination to make her remaining time meaningful for everyone around her. Dolores's pride in her granddaughter was evident as she described how Maria had channeled her grief into compassion for others, becoming a source of encouragement for neighborhood families facing their own struggles while simultaneously managing her own devastating diagnosis. The practical challenges that Dolores had faced while caring for Maria revealed another dimension of sacrifice that few people outside their situation could fully comprehend, as medical expenses had consumed their modest savings, while the emotional demands of providing constant support tested every reserve of strength she possessed. Yet throughout her description of sleepless nights, financial stress, and the heartbreak of watching someone she loved battle an enemy that couldn't be defeated through willpower alone, her tone remained filled with gratitude rather than complaint. She credited Maria's positive attitude with sustaining her own faith during moments when despair threatened to overwhelm her, explaining how her granddaughter's refusal to become bitter had taught her that grace was not the absence of suffering, but the choice to find meaning within it. The elderly woman's wisdom had been forged through experience rather than education, creating insights about love, loss, and the redemptive power of hope that impressed Manny with their depth and authenticity. The moment when Dolores presented Manny with a small wooden cross that had belonged to Maria's father created a silence that felt sacred, as the simple gift carried within it the full weight of their family's faith and the trust they were placing in him to carry forward the memory of their love. She explained that her son-in-law had carved the cross himself during quiet evenings after work, intending it as a protection charm for his daughter that would remind her of his love even when circumstances separated them. The fact that Maria had insisted on giving it to Manny as a token of their meeting demonstrated the maturity and generosity that had characterized her approach to every aspect of her illness, always looking for ways to give rather than receive despite her own overwhelming needs. The weight of the cross in Manny's palm felt disproportionate to its size, carrying as it did the concentrated love of a family that had learned to find richness in relationships rather than material possessions, meaning in moments rather than accumulation of time. The blessing that Dolores offered as the afternoon visit drew toward its close, brought together elements of traditional Filipino spirituality, grandmother's wisdom, and the kind of faith that emerges only from walking through fire without losing the ability to recognize beauty and goodness in the midst of trial. Her prayer encompassed gratitude for Manny's visit, protection for his family, and a request that their meeting might serve as encouragement for other families facing similar challenges throughout the Philippines and beyond. The words flowed with the natural rhythm of someone who had spent years talking to God about impossible situations, finding in prayer not escape from reality, but the strength to face it with dignity and hope intact. As her gentle voice filled the room with petitions for healing, comfort, and continued courage for everyone touched by this extraordinary afternoon, Manny felt himself being drawn into a circle of faith that transcended denominational boundaries and spoke directly to the universal human need for connection, meaning, and grace in the face of life's most difficult passages. The recognition that their time together was drawing to a close settled over the room like twilight, bringing with it a bittersweet awareness that some moments are too precious to last, but too perfect to regret their brevity. Maria's energy, which had seemed boundless throughout the afternoon, began showing signs of the fatigue that was her constant companion, but her spirit remained as bright as ever as she prepared to say goodbye to the man who had traveled across islands to meet her. Manny felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came before difficult farewells, understanding that this parting carried weight beyond the usual sadness of ending a pleasant visit, touching something deeper about the fundamental unfairness of life and the courage required to love people we cannot protect from pain. The late afternoon light streaming through the window seemed to soften everything it touched, creating an atmosphere that felt suspended between the earthly reality of hospital rooms and medical equipment and something more eternal that had been created through their connection. Maria's final words to Manny carried a maturity and wisdom that would echo in his mind for years to come, as she thanked him not just for his visit, but for showing her through his career that greatness was not about avoiding defeat, but about how someone responded when life delivered its hardest punches. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had learned to distill complex truths into simple statements, explaining that watching his fights had taught her the difference between losing a battle and losing the war, between temporary setbacks and permanent surrender. Her voice remained steady as she expressed gratitude for the inspiration his example had provided during her darkest moments, when pain and fear had threatened to overwhelm her faith in the possibility that life could still hold meaning and beauty even in the midst of struggle. The courage in her tone as she spoke about facing whatever came next impressed Manny more than any opponent he had ever faced in the ring, proving that heroism took many forms and that some of the greatest champions never received public recognition for their victories. The exchange of promises that followed created bonds that transcended the limitations of time and circumstance, as both committed to carrying forward the lessons they had learned from each other into whatever battles lay ahead. Manny promised Maria that her story would continue to inspire his own approach to challenges, that her example of finding purpose in pain would influence how he used his platform to encourage others facing overwhelming odds. Maria, in turn, made Manny promise that he would continue fighting not just in boxing rings, but in the larger arena of life, using his influence to remind people that ordinary individuals could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to let circumstances define their possibilities. Their mutual promises felt like sacred vows, binding them together in a partnership that would continue regardless of physical separation, each committed to honoring what they had learned from the other about courage, faith, and the transformative power of refusing to surrender hope even when victory seemed impossible. The final embrace between Maria and Manny lasted longer than either had planned, as both tried to pour into that physical connection all the gratitude, respect, and love that their brief time together had generated. Her frail arms around his shoulders carried a strength that had nothing to do with physical power, while his gentle hold communicated protection and promise that their meeting would live forever in his heart, regardless of what the future might bring. The moment felt complete in itself, requiring no words or explanations, speaking directly to the profound human need for connection and understanding that transcends all boundaries of age, circumstance, or social position. Grandmother Dolores watched through tears that had long since ceased being sad, understanding that she was witnessing something that would sustain her granddaughter's spirit during whatever trials lay ahead, and provide her own heart with memories that would transform grief into gratitude when the time came for final goodbyes. The walk to the door felt like a procession through sacred space, as each step carried Manny further from the most meaningful encounter of his life, while simultaneously ensuring that Maria's influence would travel with him to every future destination. The simple hospital room had been transformed through their meeting into a place where miracles had occurred, not the kind that changed medical diagnoses, but the deeper healing that happened when souls recognized each other across the apparent randomness of circumstances and chose to create meaning together. The hallway outside seemed unusually quiet as Manny paused at the threshold, looking back one final time at the young woman whose courage had already changed his perspective on what it meant to be a true champion. Maria's smile and small wave carried no sadness, only gratitude and peace, as if she understood that some meetings are so complete in themselves that they require no sequel to achieve their purpose of transforming everyone they touch. The departure from the medical facility felt like leaving a sanctuary where he had encountered something approaching the divine, not in terms of supernatural intervention, but in the profound recognition of what human beings could become when they chose grace over bitterness, courage over fear, and love over the natural tendency towards self-protection that difficult circumstances often inspired. As his convoy pulled away from the building where Maria continued her fight with renewed energy, Manny carried with him the certainty that he had been changed forever by meeting someone who understood better than most champions what it truly meant to win the battles that mattered most. The setting sun painted the sky in colors that seemed appropriate for marking the end of a day that would stand apart from all others in his memory, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories happen far from any crowd or camera, in quiet moments when hearts connect across the vastness of human experience and create something beautiful together, despite the darkness that threatens to overwhelm the world. 3 weeks later, Manny stood in his home chapel surrounded by the familiar silence that had always provided refuge during the most challenging moments of his life, holding in his weathered hands the wooden cross that Dolores had given him and feeling the weight of news that had arrived with the morning phone call. Maria had passed peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the love of her grandmother and the medical staff who had become like family during her final weeks, her last days filled with the joy and hope that their meeting had rekindled in her spirit. The grief that washed over him was profound, but mixed with gratitude for having been allowed to know someone whose brief life had contained more wisdom and courage than many people accumulate over decades of comfortable existence. The cross seemed to pulse with warmth in his palm, as if it carried within its simple wooden frame the concentrated love of a family that had learned to find richness in relationship rather than material accumulation, meaning in moments rather than the mere passage of time. The letter that arrived 2 days after the funeral was written in Dolores's careful handwriting, filled with gratitude for the joy that Manny's visit had brought to Maria's final weeks, and a description of how her granddaughter had spoken constantly about their meeting until her last conscious moments. The elderly woman wrote about the transformation she had witnessed in Maria following their afternoon together, how the girl had seemed to glow with renewed purpose and had spent her remaining energy encouraging other patients with stories about meeting her hero and learning that dreams really could come true in unexpected ways. The letter included photos from their visit that Dolores thought Manny might want to keep, along with pages from Maria's journal where she had recorded her thoughts about their conversation and the lessons she had learned about fighting with dignity regardless of the odds. Each page revealed the depth of impact their meeting had created, proving that sometimes the briefest encounters can generate influence that ripples far beyond the immediate moment. The foundation that Manny established in Maria's honor began as a simple idea, but quickly grew into something that reflected the scope of her vision for helping others find strength through struggle, with programs designed to support young people facing serious illness while teaching them that their circumstances didn't have to define their possibilities. The Maria Esperanza Foundation focused specifically on providing boxing instruction and mentorship to children dealing with medical challenges, based on her belief that learning to fight in the ring could teach valuable lessons about courage, persistence, and grace under pressure that applied to every area of life. The organization's motto, taken directly from her journal writings, declared that champions were made not in moments of victory, but in the quiet choices to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. The foundation's work expanded quickly throughout the Philippines, creating networks of support that connected young patients with mentors who understood that healing sometimes had less to do with medical intervention than with human connection and the restoration of hope. The annual Maria Esperanza Memorial Tournament became one of the most anticipated events in Philippine amateur boxing, drawing participants from throughout the archipelago who competed not just for trophies, but for the opportunity to embody the values of courage, sportsmanship, and compassion that had defined its namesake's approach to her own battles. Manny attended every tournament, serving as both honorary chairman and active participant in training sessions that taught young fighters to see boxing as a metaphor for life's larger struggles rather than merely a sport focused on defeating opponents. The event featured not only competition, but educational programs about health, nutrition, and emotional resilience, creating comprehensive support systems for families dealing with serious illness while celebrating the kind of heroism that often went unrecognized by mainstream media. Winners received scholarships for education and medical care, ensuring that Maria's dream of using sport to create opportunity for disadvantaged youth continued expanding its influence with each passing year. The documentary that eventually told Maria's story reached audiences far beyond the Philippines, inspiring similar programs in countries throughout Southeast Asia and demonstrating the universal power of courage to transcend cultural and linguistic boundaries. Manny participated in the film not as its star but as a witness to Maria's impact, sharing his own transformation through knowing her while ensuring that the focus remained on her example rather than his celebrity status. The project raised awareness about childhood cancer, while simultaneously highlighting the healing power of hope, community support, and the kind of faith that finds meaning within suffering rather than demanding its elimination. Critics praised the documentary for its authentic portrayal of both struggle and triumph, noting that it avoided sentimentality while capturing the profound beauty that could emerge when human beings chose to respond to tragedy with grace rather than bitterness. The letters that continued arriving at Manny's office from families around the world who had been touched by Maria's story created an ongoing reminder that her influence was expanding far beyond anything she could have imagined during her brief life. Parents wrote about children who had found strength to face their own medical challenges after hearing about the teenage girl who had turned her hospital room into a place of encouragement for others, while young patients shared how her example had taught them to see treatment as training rather than merely something to be endured. Medical professionals reported improvements in patient morale at facilities that had implemented programs based on Maria's approach to finding purpose within pain, proving that her philosophy had practical applications that extended far beyond inspiration into measurable improvements in quality of life. As Manny read each letter, he felt Maria's presence continuing to influence lives she would never meet, her legacy growing stronger rather than fading with the passage of time, a testament to the eternal power of love to triumph over even the most devastating circumstances through the simple choice to transform personal struggle into service for others facing similar battles. The cross that Maria's father had carved still occupied a place of honor in Manny's chapel, serving as a daily reminder that the greatest victories often happened far from any spotlight or public recognition. In quiet moments, when hearts chose courage over fear and compassion over self-protection, each time he held it, Manny felt connected not just to Maria and her family, but to the millions of unnamed heroes who faced their own battles with the same grace and determination she had modeled throughout her illness. Her influence had become woven into the fabric of his daily life, affecting how he approached training, competition, and the countless opportunities he had to encourage others facing challenges that seemed insurmountable. The teenage girl who had written him a letter, expressing gratitude for inspiration he hadn't known he was providing, had ultimately become his teacher, showing him that true championship was measured not in titles won, but in lives touched, not in personal achievement, but in the legacy of hope and courage that continued growing long after the final bell had rung. If you liked this story, leave your like and subscribe to our channel.